All right. Good morning, everyone.
Hi,
How's
Scott.
everyone doing
Morning.
today on
Morning,
this
Scott.
cold, snowy morning? All right. So today, before we jump back into our continuation of the presentation on um, ecology, we are on fundamentals of ecology. I first want to make an announcement. This was posted last night to Canvas. And this is an extra credit opportunity that I highly recommend that you take advantage of. So the LA Days lecture series begins tomorrow, Wednesday, with Kona Gray, and it continues approximately weekly. A couple of them are like 2 weeks apart throughout the semester. So we have 8 speakers coming, and this is an amazing lineup that we have this year. So I highly encourage all of you to attend, regardless of the extra credit. But in order to encourage you to attend these, I am offering extra credit. So the way it's going to work is that you will be able to get a half point added to your final grade for the semester. So if your final grade after everything's graded is a 94, then you can get, it'll go up to like 94.5 for each of these lectures that you attend. And to prove that you're in attendance, I just need you, I'll be in attendance at all of them. So you just need to send me a private message on the chat once the presentation starts, and let me know that you're in attendance there. And I'll keep track of everyone who contacts me as an attendance list for those lectures. So you get a half point for each lecture that you attend, and you can get an additional half point if you want to write up a summary or essay, about approximately 300 words or 1 page, summarizing what you found most interesting about the lecture, what projects had the most resonance with you, sort of any aspect of that presentation that you found most interesting. So that's up to a full point for each one of those presentations. So if you did all of them, you could raise your final grade by 8 points. So if you get a 90 at the end of the semester, that would bring your grade up to a 98. So that's a pretty significant bump. So I just wanted to make you guys aware of that extra credit opportunity. Again, the first one is tomorrow, Wednesday at 5 o'clock, Colorado time here, if any of you are out of state. And please note that you need to register for these in order to get the Zoom link so that you can attend. So do not delay too long. If you're interested in attending, you can just click at the bottom of each of the profiles, and it has a little sign up page, and then you will get a Zoom link for that you can use for attending. So any questions about that?
For the write-up, when would those be due? Is it just like at the end of the semester or like a few days after the lecture?
So each of them, I would recommend that you submit each of them within a few days after the actual presentation, just so that's, fresh in your memory. Um, I made the deadline. So basically, I set up one submission assignment page with the final for all of them. So you can submit as many as you want to that same page. And I made the final deadline on that April 30th. But I would recommend that you get those done much sooner, because obviously you don't have to write 5 or 6 essays all at the same time on April 29th. So yeah, any other questions? All right, so in that case, we will jump into the presentation. All right, so today is Fundamentals of Ecology, Part 2. And so we'll be picking up where we left off last time on Thursday of last week. And so first we're going to continue with species distribution. There was some parts of this that we didn't quite finish, and then we'll move on to, so actually, really the whole thing is about species distribution because it's in just different aspects of it. Anyway, if you remember last time, we talked about the idea of total exclusion, where one species can be entirely swamped by another species but still coexist with it because it's such a specialist that it's able to coexist within that niche, assuming that the larger, that the species that's covering more of that niche is a generalist, right? And one of you had asked a question about a specific example of that. And so I actually found a specific example of that, which is this. So I'll give you guys a second to absorb this graph and let me know. So just to give you a little background, sea urchins and limpets are both herbivores. They are marine life, and they were doing a study here where they were seeing what impact each of those organisms has on seaweed cover. And so they did an example where they had a control where both the urchins and the limpets were present, and you can see down there were very low levels of seaweed cover. Then they had one where they only removed the limpets, also low level of seaweed cover. When they removed the urchins, the population of seaweed skyrocketed. And when they removed both the limpets and the urchins, same result. The amount of seaweed cover went way up. So what does this tell you?
Is it that the limpets are more generalist?
Correct. So the limpets are the more generalist species, and the urchins are the ones who are specializing in the seaweed, right? So their population is directly impacting the amount of seaweed cover. So even though they will both consume seaweed, the urchins are specialized for the seaweed, and the limpets are happy to eat algae and other types of plant matter in the water. And so because the limpets are generalists and the urchins are specialists, they're able to coexist in that same habitat. All right, so now we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about some of the abiotic factors that affect species distribution. We touched on some of these earlier in the lecture. So obviously these include features like temperature, water, sunlight, wind, rocks, and soil. And if we take all of these abiotic factors into account together as a unit, what do they comprise?
Climate.
Climate. Yep. So here's an example of a graph that shows how those different climates are can be mapped out, where you have on the x-axis, you have the annual mean precipitation, the amount of rain that it gets or any kind of moisture really, and then the annual mean temperature on the y-axis, right? So obviously at the low end of precipitation, you have deserts, Arctic and alpine tundra is also very dry, even though it's very snowy there. They don't get a whole lot of snow. It just sticks around forever pretty much. And then as you move up in precipitation towards the right, you have things like coniferous and temperate forests, and then also with the higher temperature, tropical forests, and then grasslands obviously down sort of in a wide range of temperatures and lower precipitation than you get with forests. So that's really kind of the Colorado high plains, and much of the Front Range is that grassland type of climate. And of course, the reason that we get these different climates is that the Earth is on a tilt on its axis, right? It's not It's not directly up and down, and so it changes the amount of sunlight that you get different times of year, which changes the temperatures and brings us the seasons that we're accustomed to. Right, so you guys are, I'm sure, are all familiar with this this kind of diagram from high school science classes, basically showing how the seasons are impacted by the tilt of the Earth's axis and how that changes the amount of warmth and sunlight that different parts of the Earth receive at different times of year. But aside from temperature, there are also big impacts on moisture from the Earth's climate and from those from the tilt and from the different seasons, right? So you have the sort of basic patterns of water where in the tropics, the moist air, the moist air ascends as the moisture is evaporated from the surface, goes up and forms clouds, and then it comes down, descends, and it releases its moisture in the tropics, but then also some of it moves out into the temperate zones and releases its moisture there. So that's the sort of equatorial patterns that you have. And then that also causes global wind patterns, right? So if you look at the bottom, you can see that there are sort of these prevailing global wind patterns as well, which also impact temperature and moisture and local climate in different parts of the world. Right, and then likewise, topography has an impact on that climate. So as, and we're all familiar with this being in Colorado, is that as clouds come in from the Pacific Ocean, they drop a lot of their moisture along the coastal ranges and particularly on the western slope of the Rockies. And then we have what's known as a rain shadow on the eastern or front range slope of the Rockies, where there's not nearly as much moisture because a lot of it is has already fallen by the time that those clouds pass over the Rockies, right? And then you also get winds that pass up and over the Rocky Mountains as well. That's part of what keeps Colorado relatively mild in the wintertime, are what are known as the Chinook winds, which come down off of the high peaks in the Colorado Rockies. And as the wind is descending rapidly on the eastern slope of the Rockies, it gains temperature. And so that you end up getting these, even though the general air temperature might be cooler, you get these warm winds that come down off of the Rockies and blow across the plains. And that helps to melt snow quickly and keep the climate on the Front Range relatively mild, right? So you have all these different types of changes that happen. So what do you suspect, and particularly if I go back to this last one, which has global wind and precipitation patterns, as well as the temperature patterns that we saw earlier, what do you suppose that means for species distribution? Come on. Someone can volunteer, or I can call on someone. Cam, what do you think this does for species distribution?
I mean, I guess for like the topography, like you showed on the last slide, definitely like certain species will stay in the mountains, and then species that like the drier lands will stay below the mountains.
Yep, so obviously the topography will have an impact on that distribution. But what else when we're looking at like these global patterns? What does that mean about what do you know about some species that might be impacted by these global patterns?
Doesn't it also affect like migration patterns, like
Absolutely.
with birds?
Yeah, so migration is a type of species distribution, right? So you have large numbers of individuals that are traveling great distances as part of their migration. So they'll typically they'll go down to the tropics or the subtropics during the cooler months and reproduce. And then they, as the springtime comes in, they head back north. Some of them have like many thousands of miles of migration each year. Some of them go all the way up to the Arctic, where they tend to nest and then reproduce. And then the cycle continues the following fall when they head back to the tropics again. So you have these large sort of global distribution of species as a result of these larger climatic and seasonal changes. But you also have the same kind of effect on a smaller scale if you look at individual bodies of water. So lake stratification and mixing can alter oxygen levels and nutrient levels, and it's dependent on temperature changes and the effect that that has on water density. So obviously, particularly if you're talking about a freshwater lake, it's going to have different characteristics at different times of year. So if we look at it in the winter, it's highly stratified, right? So you have basically these zones of different levels of oxygen concentration in the water. And it's sort of a little bit lower right at the surface because typically, oftentimes you'll have ice in the wintertime that keeps the oxygen level down, but just below that frozen layer, you have a layer of high oxygen concentration. And then as you go down, you get lower and lower levels of oxygen concentration in the water, right? And so that impacts like where in the water the different species are going to be adapted to overwintering, right? So I actually have a goldfish pond in my backyard, and I don't do anything special for the goldfish when winter comes. It's frozen solid right now, or at least the top is frozen solid. Underneath, it's still liquid. And the fish tend to kind of go down towards the lower levels of the lake, and they hibernate. And those lower levels of oxygen, believe it or not, help them to get into that hibernation state. And so they overwinter underneath the ice for the entire season. And then the spring, when it thaws, they wake up and they start swimming around again. But then something different happens in the spring, right? In the spring, as the water heats up, you begin to get a cycling of the water because the temperature is affecting the density of those different layers. And so it creates this cyclical pattern of the water mixing from the lower depths up towards the surface. And as a result, you get a pretty consistent level of oxygen distribution throughout the water, all the way down to the bottom from the surface, right? So if you look at the little chart here of the oxygen distribution, you can see it's the same all the way down through the depth of that lake. Now, of course, I'll change if it's like a really, really deep lake, but for most bodies of water, it stays fairly consistent. Right, and then in summer, as the temperatures kind of stabilize, you get more stratification of the layers again, right? Where you have higher oxygen levels up towards the surface, where you have all of the activity of the organisms, the fish and the plants, and the feeding and so forth happens closer to the surface. And as you go down into the lower levels of stratification, you get much lower levels of oxygen. And then the cycle repeats itself in the fall, in the autumn, when you have, again, you have these kind of big temperature fluctuations where you have very warm days and very cold nights. And that again causes that circulation of the different layers of water from the bottom towards the surface. And you get a much more consistent level of oxygen throughout the water, right? So this happens on a micro scale, not just on a global scale, but even in individual ecosystems. And all of these affect the distribution of the species within that body of water throughout the year, changes throughout the year, depending on what those oxygen levels are and what that temperature regime is. And then abiotic factors sometimes also include significant and recurring irregular or regular change that's often catastrophic. Some species are highly adapted to these are what are known as disturbance regimes, right? And disturbance regimes can be a key component of successional processes. So can someone give me an example of what might be a significant disturbance regime, particularly here in Colorado?
that be a yearly flood, like for a river?
Yep. So flooding can be an example of a disturbance regime. What's another
Fire.
one?
What about like tornadoes?
Tornadoes. Yep, that's definitely tornadoes or windstorms. Anything that's going to knock over large numbers of trees, that would be a disturbance regime. Annie, it looked like you were trying to talk, but you were muted.
Yeah, I just said fire regimes are really important in Colorado.
Fire regimes, really important in Colorado and actually much of the Western US, right? So every year when we get those wildfires, that is a natural part of the succession of the plant communities that are adapted to the Rocky Mountains and to the Western US, right? So after a wildfire, the burn area might look like it's, you know, completely destroyed, but of course, if you go back in a year or two, you see new species regenerating that land. And many of those species are actually adapted to that fire regime where they cannot germinate until there's a fire. So there's some species that have such a hard shell casing on their seeds that they will not, it needs high heat in order for that to break open and for those species to germinate. So you have species that are actually adapted to that type of periodic change, right? And we've been kind of messing it up as humans by trying to always put out every fire everywhere as soon as it starts and not letting those fires burn. And that's part of what causes these gigantic catastrophic fires like we saw in 2020, is that we do not allow the fires to burn themselves out. Instead, we artificially extinguish them. And as a result, you get huge amounts of fuel burning, building up on the forest floor, so that when you do get a forest fire that's out of control, it just goes, it burns much more intensely and covers a much larger area because of all that fuel left behind. So if we had more managed wildfires that we would allow to burn, it would be a lot healthier for the ecosystem and a lot less damaging for human habitation. In fact, there's a film a little bit later in the semester we'll be watching on exactly that topic. And then another important concept that we'll be talking more about as we get into principles of landscape ecology is what's known as island biogeography. And that investigates and explains the size and distribution of populations with a particular interest in the role of isolation, right? So it's the idea that if you have an isolated population, the way that that population is distributed and the way that it interacts with other nearby populations is going to be impacted by the level of isolation. So some of the key concepts of that include what are known as metapopulations. So those are populations of the same species that are separated from each other, right? So for example, if let's say you have a particular species of seabird and they're inhabiting a number of different islands. They're separated by, let's say, several miles of water in between. Each of the populations that lives on those different islands is known as a metapopulation because of that isolation, but that the entire group together is still seen as one large population. You also have the idea of minimum viable population. So that's the idea that the minimum number of individuals that is needed to sustain a 99% probability of 100-year persistence, right? So basically that just means that what's the minimum number of individuals that you need in a population that's isolated in order for it to be sustainable. Then there's the idea of carrying capacity, which is the number of individuals an ecosystem can support without environmental degradation. And again, when it's hard for that species to move to a new location, particularly, you know, if you think back to Darwin and his studies with the flightless birds on the various islands, those birds can't easily move to a different habitat, right? Because they are flightless and they're stuck on that island. And so there's a certain carrying capacity that that environment can support before there's significant environmental degradation. And then the idea of habitat connectivity, which is the degree to which geographically separate habitats are connected, which allows for individuals to travel between those separated habitats. Right, and so this is an example of a littoral island, right, which is where the term comes from. And the idea that populations or metapopulations that are living on that island cannot disperse as easily as species that might be on a larger landmass because of they're confined by the water, right? So this is a littoral island, but from a habitat point of view, this is also an island, right? So you have this small patch of forest that's surrounded by agriculture. And from the point of view of the species that live in that forest habitat, they are on an island, essentially. They cannot easily jump to another similar habitat without taking great risks or potentially perishing in the process. So that's a concept that we'll be exploring a lot more once we get into some of the concepts of landscape ecology. All right, so any questions about some of those topics in species dispersal that we talked about?
Yeah, I got a quick question. So
Okay.
could that work for like bodies of water? I know it could work for like ponds maybe, but does it work in like the oceans? Like if there's specific species that stay within a range, is that kind of the same thing, or is that mostly inland?
Within the ocean, it's less of an issue because typically the vast majority of sea life actually lives very close to all the shores. Like within a mile or two of the shore is the vast majority of sea life. And then there's a lot less of it once you get out to open ocean. When you're talking about oceans, it's more about the depth that determines sort of what is the appropriate habitat for different species. But if you talk about freshwater bodies, then yes, you can have that same impact, but sort of in reverse, where species, particularly like amphibians or other species that can travel over land for short distances, having isolated bodies of water will impact their level of isolation, and therefore will be kind of subject to a lot of those same topics that we were talking about with island biogeography.
Okay.
Hey Scott, I had a quick question.
Sure.
So like with the global wind patterns, can that affect like specific like plant species as well, like spreading like their seeds around, or?
Absolutely. So there are lots of species that are adapted to wind dispersal of seeds, and they rely on those global wind patterns to spread their seeds within particular. And again, these are, it's not, when I say they rely on it, it sounds like there's some intention there, like the plant wants to spread their seeds that way. But of course, it's just, through natural selection that the species that have those wind dispersal adapted seeds tend to do better because they are able to disperse better.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you, Scott.
All right, so the next part we're going to look at are invasive and introduced species. And these are species that are not native to a particular ecosystem that are introduced from elsewhere in the world. And sometimes they just overpopulate that new ecosystem and they can have disastrous impacts. So we'll be looking at a couple of examples of these. One is the African honeybee, another is the zebra mussel, and another is the gray squirrel. So some introductions are intentional. And the question is, why do the successful invaders succeed? Does anyone have an idea about why oftentimes these invaders from other habitats can invade a new habitat and be like hyper successful?
They're generalists.
Yes, that's one part of it. So oftentimes they are generalist species. So they can take advantage of many more of the resources in that particular habitat.
They don't have any natural predators like in their home.
Exactly. So, and it's not just predators, but it's also just competition. So there's no natural competition for those species, and they just kind of run rampant. and they're able to use up all of the resources in that habitat. And oftentimes that can result in the collapse of that habitat when all of those resources get used up, right? So one thing to note is that most introductions of new species are through natural processes. So transportation of seeds across continents by wind, as Edwin was just talking about, the transport of aquatic species by birds, and other forms of dispersal like that. But some of them are intentional and are introduced by humans, and usually without the knowledge of sort of what the end result will be of introducing these new species. Right, so the first example is the African honeybee. And the African honeybee it's adapted obviously to Africa, as the name suggests, but they were introduced to parts of South America back in the 1950s as an alternate to the native honeybee populations for honey production and cultivation. However, they have been spreading steadily ever since the 1950s. And you can see how their range has drastically expanded. They are able to outcompete the native honeybee species, and they're hyper aggressive as well. So they'll take over other native honeybee colonies. And so they typically lead to the basically the localized extinction of native honeybee populations. And you can see that they've been spreading all throughout South America, up northward, and they are well into the United States. This particular diagram only goes up to 1998, but they've spread even further into the United States since then in the 2000s. So that's one example of an introduced species that has had sort of disastrous impacts on the local populations of native honeybees. Zebra mussels are another example. So zebra mussels were accidentally introduced. They were on the bottom of a ship that came in and was traveling through the Great Lakes and through the various canals into the Great Lakes, and ended up there, you can see, in Michigan in 1988. And by 1992, you can see by the red dots there, all of the places that they had spread to in the various waterways of the upper US. By 1994, they had spread all the way down the Mississippi to Louisiana. And by 1999, again, they were spreading east and west to more and more water bodies. And the zebra mussels, again, are a hyper-competitive species. They don't have any natural predators in North America, and they just multiply unrestricted, essentially. And they're able to sort of take over and choke out the other life forms in localized habitats. And then we have squirrels in Britain, right? So the red squirrel is native to Britain, and its population has declined due to a number of different factors, including disease, disappearance of habitat. So they prefer hazel coppices and mature conifer forests in lowland Britain, and those have been disappearing as greater levels and higher intensity levels of development have been spreading into those habitats, but also through competitive exclusion, right? And so we had talked about the idea of competitive exclusion, which is that if you have two species that essentially have the exact same niche, one of them will be excluded from that niche, and they'll be outcompeted. And that's due to the alien species, which is the gray squirrel, right, which was introduced to Britain in about 30 sites between 1876 and 1929, not for any particularly good reason, just because people coming over to the United States liked the gray squirrels and thought they would do well in Britain, and boy, were they right. They brought them back to Britain, and they were released in the wild, and now they have overtaken the red squirrel habitat. and largely replace the red squirrel. The native red squirrel is very hard to find now. So if we look at the species distribution of the gray squirrel on the left there, you can see how much of Great Britain is occupied by the gray squirrel, and you have much more limited habitat now for the red squirrel, right? And the red squirrel used to occupy pretty much all of the British Isles before the gray squirrel was introduced, and now their numbers and their distribution is much more limited. So that's a perfect example of competitive exclusion and how species distribution can be impacted by that level of competition.
Scott,
Yes.
why did the gray squirrel do a lot better in Britain than the red one?
The gray squirrel, so one part of it was that they were adapted to a wider range of temperature extremes. So they were able to just kind of survive better in a wider range of places. And as a result, outcompete the red squirrels. But they're also just, a lot of it has to do with aggressiveness. Gray squirrels are far more aggressive than the red squirrels, and they'll just kind of like move in, and they're not afraid of the red squirrels, and they'll just, you know, go in and basically take over all of the resources in a particular place. And the red squirrels are just not, you know, competitively as aggressive, and so they get outcompeted.
Okay.
All right, so next we're going to talk about biomes, because biomes are really, when we talk about ecosystems, biomes are like gigantic, sort of globally pervasive types of ecosystems that you find repeating again and again in different parts of the world. So the definition of a biome is a large, naturally occurring community of plants and animals occupying a major habitat that have common characteristics for the environment in which they exist. A secondary definition is that it's a type of biological community that recurs in many places around the world, having formed in response to a common geomorphology and climate. So if we look at an example, so there's an example of an aquatic biome, right? This is a freshwater aquatic biome. We find these in lots of different places around the world, and all of those individual habitats of freshwater, all taken together, make up that freshwater biome. Here's another example. This is a terrestrial biome on land. So this is obviously a forest biome, in this case, a conifer forest. And these different biomes have different characteristics, and they have different criteria in terms of like what types of species live there based on moisture and temperature regimes. Right, so the two major types of biomes are the aquatic biomes, which have to do with any bodies of water, and then the terrestrial biomes, which are on the land. So the first type of aquatic biome is the marine biome, right? So the marine biome is a subset of the Earth's aquatic biomes. It's the world's largest biome. It accounts for about 70% of the Earth's surface and contains about 90% of all life on Earth. It has the greatest biodiversity of all of the biomes, right? So that's basically our oceans and seas and any saltwater bodies are part of that marine biome. And so in many ways, that is the most important biome on Earth because it has so much of Earth's life and accounts for so much of the Earth's surface. And we are destroying it at a record pace with all of our plastic and trash and whatnot that's forming these massive islands in the ocean that create dead zones. Does anyone know another way that we're killing marine biomes? So trash is one way. What's another way that we're killing marine biomes?
Oil drilling.
Oil, yep. So a lot of oil drilling happens in that marine biome. And as we've seen a number of different examples over the decades of mishaps on drilling platforms that result in massive amounts of oil being released into those biomes. What else?
I was gonna
Ocean
say
acidification?
nuclear waste, like the Fukushima incident. It's like actively leaking nuclear waste
Yep.
into the Pacific,
Yeah,
right?
nuclear waste in the example. I heard somebody else saying something.
Ocean
Fissures.
acidification?
Sorry, go ahead, Becky.
I don't know. I say fishers using bombs to fish. I've seen a lot of them, especially in my country.
Sorry, you're breaking up. I can't quite understand what you're saying.
So fishers using bombs to catch.
Did anyone else get that?
He said fishers using bombs.
Fishers
To go-
using bombs. Okay.
Yeah.
Or actually, yeah, I suppose that would be definitely an impact, or warfare in general and the kind of remnants of warfare. What else?
Ocean acidification?
Ocean acidification. Yep, we are changing the acidity of the oceans, and in fact the chemical composition of the oceans, both through global climate change and through contamination and pollution. And then
Just
there's
like-
another big one that kind of happens fairly periodically in coastal marine biomes.
Well, I was just gonna say like the effect that we have on like the temperature of the ocean too.
Right. So the temperature is definitely increasing as a result of global climate change.
Sea level rise?
Sea level rise, right? That's part of that that global climate change, because you have more of the ice caps melting, which results in higher sea levels. But there's one that happens every summer, or many summers, in our coastal waters, and it has to do with activity on the land.
Is it algae blooms?
Yes, algae blooms. Very good. So do you know what causes those algae blooms?
Isn't it like fertilizer runoff and other stuff like
Absolutely. So you have fertilizer from agriculture that gets washed into local waterways, and then that in turn gets concentrated into larger and larger rivers that empty into our oceans and bays. And then all of that high level of nutrient causes algae blooms. So what's so bad about algae blooms? Why is that a problem?
They take down the oxygen level of the water.
Absolutely. They take down the oxygen level, and they create these dead zones where fish can't survive. Right. They also block out all of the light that gets down to the lower depths of those bays and marine environments. Right. So we're having huge impacts on that marine biome, and it's definitely a huge area of concern that a lot of research is going into in terms of how we can stop and or reverse a lot of the impacts that we've had so far. There are a couple of different types of marine biomes. There are seas and oceans. So those are like obviously the massive bodies of water like the Pacific and the Atlantic. You have coral reefs, which tend to be closer to land and are extremely biodiverse and have high levels of productivity. And then you also have estuaries, right? So that's saltwater and brackish wetlands that happen at the interface between the land and those bodies of saltwater. Does anyone know what the word brackish means?
It's like a mix between fresh and salt water.
Exactly. It's a mix between fresh and saltwater. And in fact, as the tide goes in and out, the levels of salinity in the water will change. And you have plant species that are adapted to those changing levels of salinity in the water, right? So you have these various types of wetlands that have adapted over time to both pure salt water and to brackish water. And then, as I mentioned, you also have big changes in the marine environment that vary with depth. Right. And so as you go down in depth, you tend to get fewer species. Most of them live in that photic zone, which is the first 1,000 feet there, right closest to the surface. And as you get deeper and deeper, you have fewer species, but far more interesting looking species, at least from a point of view of familiarity, because you have these species that are adapted to essentially living in the dark, or gaining their resources not from the typical sort of oxygen levels that were associated with most species that we're familiar with. So you have species that are adapted to the sea floor, and all these, you know, when you go way down deep in the ocean, you get these very strange species that are just adapted to the conditions down there and look like creatures from another planet. So the marine biome locations in the world, everything that's colored in that sort of grayish blue here, that's the marine biome. Obviously, it's a massive area of land and covers most of the Earth. And then next we have the freshwater biome. So the freshwater biome is also a subset of Earth's aquatic biomes, and it includes surface aquatic environments with low salt content. It's home to a wide array of species and is the source of hydration for all terrestrial animals. It is second only to the marine biome in terms of biodiversity, but makes up less than 1% of all surface water on Earth. Right, so if we take all of the surface water, including both saltwater and freshwater, that makes up about approximately a little over 70% of the Earth's surface. But of that 70+%, only 1% is surface freshwater. So it's a tiny percentage of all of the water available on Earth, but it is the source of all drinking water on Earth for all terrestrial animals, including us humans. And there are a few different types of freshwater biomes, right? So there are streams and rivers, there are ponds and lakes. So streams and rivers obviously are moving bodies of fresh water, usually that are moving from higher elevations to lower elevations, generally as a result of snowmelt and rainfall in the higher elevations that then moves downstream. You have ponds and lakes, which are isolated, non-moving bodies of water. And then you have freshwater wetlands. And freshwater wetlands can have either permanent bodies of water, or they can have periodic dry spells where the wetland is dry, at least at the surface. Usually there's still high water content in the soil, but the surface may dry up completely and then get inundated again on a periodic basis. And these are the second most productive type of biome, right? So the thing we're seeing in common is that the more water you have in a place, the higher the level of biodiversity and the greater the level of productivity of that particular environment. And so this is showing the distribution of the freshwater biome across the Earth, right? So you can see some of the places that you might recognize. Obviously, the Great Lakes are easy to pick out on here. If you look down South America, you have the Amazon Basin is another major freshwater environment or habitat. But you also have a lot in some of these northern climates. Like look up here and, you know, like a lot of northern Canada, that's part of the freshwater biome, right? What is the problem with that portion of the freshwater biome?
Usually like frozen.
Yeah, it's all
Yeah,
frozen.
it spends most of the year frozen. It only thaws out for during a couple of months in the summertime, and then it freezes again. So in terms of having a water supply for sustaining life, that's not a reliable source because it's frozen for most of the year. It's only usable as drinking water for a few months in the summertime. Right, so when you really look at the amount of fresh water on Earth, there isn't a whole lot. It's kind of amazing how much life is sustained by how little water on fresh water, at least on the surface of the Earth. And then next, at the opposite end of the moisture scale, we have the desert biome. And so the desert biome is characterized by infrequent but often intense rainfall events, soil with very little organic matter, large differences between daytime and nighttime temperatures, and drought-tolerant plants and animals. And this is the kind of biome that I spent time in for about 10 days over the winter break down in Arizona. What kind of cacti are these? Are so iconic for that desert biome? Anyone know what type of cacti these are that we're looking at? These tall ones?
Barrel?
What's that?
Are they barrel cactuses?
Nope, the barrel cactuses are actually the little round ones that get to be about 18 inches or 2 feet tall with the yellow spikes on them. These tall ones are actually saguaro cactus. And in fact, Saguaro National Park is down there in Arizona, just east and west of Tucson. And you see these cacti everywhere. And they're actually, they're really interesting. I learned a lot about saguaro cactus while I was down there. I never knew much about them before I went down there, but they are very slow growing plants, obviously because there's such low moisture levels in the soil. And the rain is so infrequent that they grow they'll have a growth spurt when there's a lot of moisture, and then they basically don't grow at all for the rest of the year. And they grow so slowly that by the time, so you see this one in the foreground has an arm coming out. On average, a cactus has to be at least 70 years old before it has enough, enough height and enough moisture to form an arm. So when you see a cactus that has an arm on it, it's at least 70 years old. And when it has multiple arms on it, often hundreds of years old. So even though they don't get all that tall, they kind of max out at around 30 or 40 feet, which is still pretty tall for a cactus. They can be hundreds of years old. And a lot of them actually died in parts of Arizona, particularly around Phoenix this past summer, because Arizona, or at least the Phoenix area, went something like 282 days without any rainfall, which was a record. And as a result, even the cacti couldn't survive that long a time without rainfall. And many of them died. And in fact, you'll see cacti just laying on the ground, decomposing. And it's kind of fascinating because they're basically hollow tubes with like a sort of a spongy matrix in the middle. And as they decompose, you can see that those ridges that you see going vertically in the cacti are basically these kind of woody, basically like straws, essentially, that help transport the water throughout the body of the cactus. And as they decompose, everything goes away except for those ridges. So you get this kind of, it almost looks like a skeleton because it's hollow inside, and you just get these, the remnants of the woody parts of those ridges behind. So it's really interesting to see kind of cacti in this sort of dead and decomposing state. So I just kind of learned a lot about them. They're really interesting type of species. So these are locations of the desert biomes worldwide, right? And a lot of them are associated with the equator in areas of low rainfall, obviously. So those are places where you have very hot daytime temperatures, not a lot of moisture. And so you end up with a desert biome. They can get very cold at night, however. You'll notice, obviously, the Southwest United States and down in through Mexico is a major one. Over in Asia, you have the Mongolian desert. You have down in Australia, you have a large portion of the outback that is a desert biome, and then a few down in South America as well. And the locations of these are related to those global moisture patterns that we were seeing earlier in terms of where the rainfall tends to happen the most as a result of those temperature and wind patterns that distribute that rainfall. And so the places where it doesn't get distributed, you tend to get these desert biomes. Next is the taiga forest biome. And the taiga forest biome is the driest and coldest of the 3 different forest biomes that we'll be looking at. They're typified by extensive coniferous evergreen forests growing in thin soils. And they have a short growing season, and the predominant plant species are adapted to periodic wildfire events. This is the location of the taiga biome. So basically only in the northern hemisphere and in the subarctic regions is where you get those, is where you get the taiga biome. So it's basically the coldest and driest of the forest biomes that you get in the northern latitudes.
Would that be like the tundra then?
Tundra is actually a different biome. So this is adjacent to the tundra. True tundra is a place where basically you get very little or no plant life because it's frozen year round. We'll be looking at that tundra biome in a minute, but this is just adjacent. It's basically sort of one level warmer than that pure tundra biome. And then next we have the temperate forest biome. The temperate forest biome is characterized by moderate to high rainfall amounts and a predominance of woody trees and shrubs interspersed with species of herbs, shrubs, climbers, lichen, and algae, and a variety of wild animals and birds. Right, so temperate forests are probably the ones that most of us are familiar with because they tend to occur in the same latitudes where humans tend to live in the greatest populations. So you can see the eastern third of the United States is a large forest biome, temperate forest biome, most of Europe, and then throughout East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea is, and then coastal areas of Australia and South America. So those are our temperate forest biomes. And then of course you have a rainforest biome. Whoops. And the rainforest biome is characterized by high rainfall and temperate or tropical climates. Rainforests are densely vegetated with moisture-loving plants such as ferns and mosses, and they have the greatest biodiversity of all of the land biomes. So we're looking at terrestrial biomes. The rainforest has the greatest biodiversity and the greatest productivity, again, because they have the highest level of moisture of all of the land biomes. Notice that rainforest biomes can be temperate or tropical climates. Most people think of tropical climates, but they don't have to be a tropical climate. So if we look at the distribution of the rainforest biome, a lot of it does happen in those tropical areas. So you have the Amazon basin again, the tropical areas of South America. And then you have an area of that in Central Africa. And then of course in Southeast Asia and parts of coastal Australia. However, and then of course like Florida and the Southeast United States is known for that kind of climate as well. However, you'll notice that there are also some in the higher latitudes, particularly in the Northwest United States and up along the coast of Canada. Has anyone been to that part of the rainforest biome?
Yeah.
What's up there? What do you associate that biome with?
I mean, there's a lot of ferns.
Yeah, there's a lot of ferns, like gigantic ferns too. They're like taller than, than a person is. What else do you associate that with?
Redwood.
Well,
Yes, the redwood. I think it was Annie said the redwood forests. And up in the coastal portions of the Northwest, you get the redwood forests. And if you ever go hiking in there, it is absolutely a rainforest, even though it's a temperate rainforest. It gets all of that moisture coming in off of the ocean, and you get these gigantic ferns. You get the redwoods that grow to be 300 feet tall and have these massive trunks. And it's just a very highly biodiverse and productive portion of North America. Then we have the prairie biome. So prairies are a temperate grassland biome that's characterized by mild climates, moderate rainfall, and a composition of grasses, herbs, and shrubs rather than trees as the dominant vegetation type. Right, and here we see something that's very familiar to us in Colorado, an example of a prairie biome. And these are the locations of the major prairie biomes around the world. Of course, the Midwest and Western United States is a big part of it, but you also have large portions of that in Central Asia. Excuse me. But also down in Australia and then South America. I am so sorry. All right, and then we have the savanna biome, another type of grassland, also related to the prairie biome, but this is a tropical grassland biome, and the typical vegetation includes rolling grasslands, scattered shrubs, and widely spaced trees with canopies that usually do not meet. Savannas have a very wet summer season and a dry winter season and are home to large herds of animals. Right, so this is the tropical version of the prairie biome that we have here in the United States, and these occur in all the areas where we see the yellow. So, of course, the savannas of Africa are the ones that people are most familiar with and can constitute the largest portion, but there are also areas in South America and Australia that are savanna biomes. And then we have the tundra biome. And the tundra biome is a series of treeless regions found in the Arctic and on the tops of mountains where the climate is cold and windy and rainfall is scant. It is characterized by permafrost and matted, low-growing plant life. Right, so permafrost meaning that you have a portion of the soil that is frozen year-round. And so you only get moisture at the very surface of the soil. And that's why you get these sort of very low growing plants that are adapted to those low amounts of moisture. And also because it's so windy, they tend to kind of hug the ground where it's the warmest in order to avoid those high winds that are constantly raking the landscape in that tundra biome. And of course, the tundra biomes are located at the extremes of the northern and southern poles. So along the coastal areas of Antarctica and along the northern latitudes of North America and Asia. So that ends our coverage of the biomes, and that ends our coverage of sort of basic ecological principles and sets the stage for the landscape ecological principles that we'll start diving into on Wednesday. So any questions about anything that we covered today? Stop my share here. There we go. All right. Well, thank you all, and I'll see you on Wednesday, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks,
Scott.
Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.